When we think of winter in warfare, first thing that comes to mind is usually all the failed attempts at attacking Russia, such as from Nazi Germany and Napoleon. But really, we just think of Russia. In ancient history, we like to think that most of the combat and campaigning took place from spring to early autumn. This is usually true, but not 100% of the time. Many times during Antiquity, they would continue to wage war, even during the winter, which was sometimes preferable. Okay, well maybe not preferable, but it did have its own unique advantages. And for this video, we'll be focusing on how the ancient Greeks and Romans used it. Alright, so let's start with why the combat was done from spring to early autumn. Since most of the soldiers that made up the army were citizens, most of them had day jobs as farmers. So whenever the harvest would come up during the fall, the army would need to disband in order to complete the harvest. But on the other side of this coin, there were also professional or mercenary armies that wouldn't have this problem since they were soldiers by trade. Surprisingly enough, most armies would be established by the central government during Antiquity, as was the case with the Roman Empire, as well as King Philip II of Macedonia, and later his son, Alexander the Great's army. The Greek city-state armies, such as Athens and Sparta, would supplement their armies with mercenaries, allowing for winter operations. So how were these winter campaigns conducted exactly? Well, sometimes they weren't really by choice. Take Xenophon for instance, when he had to famously retreat with his 10,000 soldiers after Cyrus the Younger's failed rebellion. Xenophon was forced to escape from within the Persian Empire, and what followed was a brutal winter where the army would have fallen, if not for the food of the villagers from Armenia. Now while this was technically a winter campaign, like George Washington and Valley Forge, it arose out of an emergency, rather than by strategic choice. But now, a more accurate representation of winter warfare would be that of the neighboring city-states of the Argives and the Epidaurians during the Archidamian War. Both sides would conduct raids on the other's territories, and they would also set up ambushes for those trying to attempt the raids. These raids were probably a lot easier to organize during the winter, since smaller raiding bands would require less supplies, yet they were still able to inflict damage on the enemy. The barbarians during the time of the Roman Empire actually followed this in a similar manner. During the end of the 1st century, the winter months would often result in raids across the frozen Danube River. These raids would also be small and quick, but would manage to destroy the villages across the Danube, leaving the place desolate. To just what extent this was all true is still an active debate among historians, though I'd be pretty surprised if they found otherwise. But enough about these small raids. Let's get into what actual military operations these armies would take. Well, sorry to disappoint, but more often than not, they would just rest inside their winter quarters. Cause let's be honest, who in their right mind would want to campaign during the winter? There's even a famous story of Emperor Maurice of the Byzantine Empire getting overthrown and killed just from mentioning that he wanted to push a winter campaign. So clearly, winter operations were less than desirable, but unfortunately for them, sometimes necessary. Take the Romans for example. They would often have to campaign into the winter months just to carry on sieges. Sieges were the likeliest scenario for any army to even consider a winter campaign. In order to get the soldiers to agree with this, when the Romans decided to siege the city of Veii, they introduced a pay system for the soldiers. This would be the common practice when the Republic would expand, during the Punic Wars and any subsequent wars. As mentioned earlier, the most common practice would be to just make a fort and quarter for the winter, though they would sometimes continue the sieges and raid operations if necessary. Like when the Gauls rose up in the winter, and Caesar had to launch an emergency campaign to bring them to heel. This was a strategic move, yet also out of urgency, because if he waited any longer, he might have lost Gaul entirely, and wasted the last few years of his life. Another example of this was in 193, when the Roman general Gaius Flaminius set up his forts in the winter to prevent the Iberians from raiding them. This was a mixed bag, as he was just as lucky to succeed as he was to fail. He eventually was able to force them into a pitched battle, where he defeated the Iberian army and captured their king, ending the war and bringing parts of Spain under Roman control. The Romans would also use this to their advantage against the barbarians. They would campaign against them in the winter, so that they wouldn't have anywhere to hide, and so their movements would be limited due to a lack of supplies. This allowed the Roman army to catch up to them and confront them. This was a strategy used by General Arbogast of the Roman Empire when he led a campaign against the barbarians along the Rhine. So while the Romans weren't particularly keen to winter warfare, they weren't completely against it either. Now, we can't talk about ancient warfare without bringing up Alexander the Great. He would sometimes use the winter months to surprise his enemies, like when he ordered his left-hand man, Parmenion, to conquer central Turkey after the Battle of Granicus River. Surprisingly enough, some of his more famous battles took place during the winter months, such as the Battle of Issus or the Battle of the Persian Gates, in which Alexander defeated the Persian general Ariobarzanes and took control of the Persian capital, which he immediately proceeded to burn down. Some of his other impressive feats of winter campaigning were when he crossed the Hindu Kush to chase the Persian king Bessus, or when he campaigned in Bactria and Sogdia when they rose up against him. So even though the Romans chose winter warfare out of necessity, Alexander chose it because he preferred it. Even under Alexander, his generals would also use the winter to their advantage. For instance, during the War of Diadochi, Antigonus launched an ambitious campaign against Eumenes of Cardia. He had two options: A. Take the safe supplied route, allowing him to engage with Eumenes in 20 days, or B. A forced march across the desert, allowing him to make it in 10 days. Option A would take Eumenes by surprise, while the other option would give away his position and allow Eumenes to organize and prepare for the battle. So, Antigonus opted for the latter, supplying his men and telling them not to light any fires. But unfortunately for them, this was in the middle of the winter, so his soldiers had to light fires in order to stay alive. This would give away their position, but unfortunately for Eumenes, he couldn't do anything about it, since his troops were all quartering for the winter. So by the time it would take his army to gather and organize, Antigonus would most likely already be there. So Eumenes cunningly comes up with a plan to fool Antigonus. He goes into the hills and his soldiers light as many fires as they can, in order to trick Antigonus into thinking that the army was already organized. Antigonus, taking note of the campfires, decides to take the safer route. Since he had already lost the element of surprise, he at least wanted his soldiers to be well rested. Antigonus tries his strategy again later, during the Third Diadochi War, when he tries to invade Egypt through the Sinai Desert. Though the plan was well organized, a winter storm destroyed a third of his fleet, eliminating his supplies and forcing him to turn back. Someone should really tell this guy winter attacks aren't his thing. So what did we learn today, class? Though loosely, winter campaigning was used in ancient times, whether it be raiding and sieging, or for strategic purposes like rooting out enemies and taking them by surprise. They were only able to execute these strategies though, because their state was well organized and could supply the armies at all times. So while not exactly the most comfortable place for a soldier, sometimes a little marching in the snow is what's needed, so that the wars could be finished before summertime. Warning, this video does not apply to Russia. Russian winters play by their own rules and can turn anyone into a popsicle. Just ask Vlad, he's kind of a pro at this. Hey, thanks for watching the video. I know we couldn't cover every example of winter warfare, but we did the most we could with our limited resources. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and make sure to leave a comment, because we're always reading them.